How did Israel become slaves in Egypt? How did their slavery affect God's promises to give Israel their own nation and their own land? When we look at Israel today, can we believe God's word? In our last study, we reflected on the interactions between the members of Isaac's and Israel's families. We saw how the partiality shown by the parents towards certain of their children resulted in much grief and lifelong problems. Not the least of these consequences was that Joseph was sold by his brothers to a caravan of merchants and was taken to Egypt, where he became a slave. In this study, we will briefly consider slavery then and now, and we will find out what became of Joseph after he was taken from his home, how Israel came to be enslaved in Egypt, and what the consequences were for both nations. Slavery has been a common practice since mankind's earliest days. However, legal ownership of people was in fact abolished in all countries over the course of the last 2 centuries. Yet, in almost half of the world's countries, there is no criminal law penalizing either slavery or the slave trade. Data from 2019 to 2020 shows that countries with the largest numbers of slaves are India, China, Pakistan, North Korea, Nigeria, Iran, Indonesia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Russia, and the Philippines. According to recent studies, some of the worst forms of slavery occur in such countries as Sudan, Mauritania, Somalia, Angola, Pakistan, Nepal, and Myanmar. The official ban on slavery in these countries either exists only on paper or is not supported by any serious punitive measures. So, for example, in Mauritania, where generational slavery has been practiced since the 13th century, the descendants of black people enslaved many generations ago make up the slave caste owned by the Arabs. The number of slaves in the country is estimated at 600,000 people, which is 20% of the population, the highest percentage in the world. It is estimated that 25% of the world's slaves are children. 71% are women and girls. Modern forms of slavery include human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, descent-based slavery, child labor, forced and early marriage, domestic servitude, and sex trafficking. In the 19th century, slaves were extremely expensive and constituted a large investment for their owners. By contrast, today's slavery has 2 chief characteristics. It is cheap and disposable. So when a slave gets sick or injured, they are simply dumped or killed. Does the Bible justify slavery? What does the Bible say about slavery? The scriptures neither justify nor condemn the practice of slavery. They give instructions on how slaves should conduct themselves and be treated in a culture where slavery was common practice. We read in the New Testament in reference to slaves, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. And he, masters, do the same things unto them, forbearing, threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven. Neither is there respect of persons with him. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that he also have a master in heaven." So we see that God commands slaves to obey their masters, and masters to treat their slaves fairly, without bullying or intimidation, making provision for them, and in the fear of God, knowing that the Lord is our heavenly master and judge. In New Testament times, many slaves had a surprising level of legal and social status. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, and even politicians were sometimes slaves. In the Old Testament, the law freed slaves every seventh year. Slaves were most often the result of war or economics. For example, people who could not pay their debts or support their family. Both the Old and New Testaments condemn the practice of slave trafficking, and according to the law of Moses, the punishment for such actions was death. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. What we need to understand is that the purpose of the Bible is to indicate the way to salvation and transform men, not to reform society. A person who has found God's gift of salvation and freedom from the bondage of sin will understand that it is wrong to enslave another person. As we examine the life of Joseph, we found that he was forcibly sold into slavery. His own brothers acknowledged that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Israel's cherished son, sold as a slave. How did Joseph react to this? He did not complain about his fate. He did not try to escape. He did not protest. He accepted that he was a slave and did his job faithfully and diligently. At that time, he was 17 years old. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had put into his hand. And it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. Because Joseph was industrious, honest, and hardworking, he was promoted by his master to the position of steward of all his property. Whatever Joseph did, he did it first and foremost for God. Even as a youth, he was a man of integrity. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? How does Joseph respond when his master's wife tries to seduce him? Does he go along with her? As she spake to Joseph day by day? No. He considers that his master trusts him and that he would be sinning against God, and rejects her advances. So she falsely accuses him of attempted rape. That she called unto the men of the house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me. And I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled, and got him out. It is worth considering that a slave accused of such a crime as attempting to rape his mistress should have been killed. We could ask ourselves whether the master believed his wife. in any case, is enraged by the situation and has Joseph jailed with Pharaoh's political prisoners. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. So far, we have seen Joseph sold as a slave by his brothers because they were jealous of him. Now he's thrown into prison because he refused to be seduced by his master's wife. He did nothing to deserve either. On the contrary, his conduct is commendable. Does he rail against his fate? Does he blame God for all the injustice he suffers? Is he bitter and angry? No, he accepts his circumstances as from God. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Everything that Joseph did, he did to the best of his ability. He had great faith in God, realizing that God is in control of every situation. And because of his attitude to life and faith in God, he was soon noticed by the ruler of the prison and promoted to a place of authority over the inmates. Think of the teenagers, Would you expect this attitude and behavior from any of them? What about us? Do we accept the irritations, frustrations, difficulties, and injustices of life? Or do we complain, argue, become angry and bitter, try to manipulate our situation, or fall into a depression? Like Joseph, we need to accept everything that happens from the hand of God, and that everything he does is for our good and his glory, and part of his plan for our lives. Over time, we will look back at our lives and realize that God is in control of everything. While Joseph was in prison, Pharaoh had a prophetic dream that no one could interpret. Because Joseph had been imprisoned with the king's servants and was known to interpret dreams, he was called before Pharaoh. God enabled him to explain Pharaoh's dream, and as a result, he was appointed prime minister of Egypt. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. Notice that Joseph's master, the ruler of the prison, and now Pharaoh, all understand that Joseph is different. They knew that the Spirit of God was in him. It took Joseph 13 years to become Egypt's prime minister. When he was sold into slavery, he was 17 years old. Now he's turning 30. And for all these 13 years, he has been either a slave or a prisoner. Joseph had explained that Pharaoh's dream was a prophecy about a coming time of abundance and then famine. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And Joseph, on behalf of Pharaoh, prepared a great store of food throughout all the land of Egypt against the famine. But we find that the famine affects all the surrounding lands, not just Egypt. Now, when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said unto his sons, Why do ye look one upon another? And he said, Behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither and buy for us from thence. that we may live and not die. Joseph had been sold into slavery as a teenager. He was now a 39-year-old man and clearly altered. He was no longer a slave. He looked, spoke, and dressed like an Egyptian. He was the prime minister of the land. Of course, the brothers did not recognize him after 22 years. In fact, they thought him dead. However, Joseph recognized them. And Joseph was the governor over the land. And it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them. Here we see the prophetic dream that Joseph had, and for which his brothers hated him, being fulfilled. As a result, Joseph received his brothers, and we can see in him such qualities as honesty and lack of hypocrisy, a forgiving spirit, sincere love for his father and brothers, and loyalty to God. But as for you, he thought evil against me, but God made it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Since Joseph knew that there were still 5 years of famine ahead, he called his family to Egypt. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. So Israel arrives in Egypt at God's command and in fulfillment of God's plan and purpose. There were just 70 Israelites at that time, and because of Joseph's high and valued position, they were allocated the best of the land of Egypt. And the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Joseph died at the age of 110 years. Of these, he lived in Egypt for 93 years. And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and he shall carry up my bones from hence. God had told Abraham that his seed shall be stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. This promise was passed down from father to son, so that Joseph knew of it and believed God. Before he died, Joseph also gave a prophecy that God would return Israel to the land of promise and charge the Israelites to take his bones out of Egypt and transfer his remains to the promised land. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. 400 years have passed since Israel and his family went to live in Egypt. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. This new king was not the son or grandson of the Pharaoh, whose right hand Joseph was. More than one generation has changed in 400 years. Perhaps the son of Pharaoh knew Joseph and respected him, And maybe his grandson also heard about Joseph. But over time, a king rose up who did not know Joseph at all, who did not understand why these people were there, who saw that they were more numerous and stronger than the Egyptians. Two things Pharaoh was very much afraid of. One, that if there was a war, the Israeli people would unite with the enemy and go against Egypt. Two, that if the entire Israeli people left Egypt, the economy would collapse. It is this Pharaoh who made the children of Israel into slaves to Egypt. As a result of Pharaoh's attitude, the Israelites found themselves in a very difficult situation. The Egyptians treated them harshly, exploited them, and killed their sons, so that they turned to God for deliverance. Do we find this in our own lives? That it is when we go through difficulties that we also remember God and forget Him through the good times? Does God have to get our attention? The ultimate consequences for Egypt of enslaving Israel would be devastating. Their land, crops and animals would be decimated. Their economy would collapse. Their army would be destroyed. Their firstborn sons would die. Their king would be killed. And they would lose their Israeli slaves. Anyway, up to more than 2 million people would leave Egypt, based on Numbers chapter 1, verse 46, which states that the males aged 20 years and upward numbered 600,000 a year after leaving Egypt. The consequences for Israel were that they were freed from their bondage and led out of Egypt to the promised land. God keeps His word. We can draw a parallel between their persecution by and freedom from Egypt to possess the promised land, to the persecution of Jews leading up to and during the Second World War. It was this persecution that resulted in the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Consider that throughout history, Jews have very often occupied high positions wherever they lived: financial, political, business, professional. How likely is it that people living in comfort and affluence, well settled and accepted as an integral part of their society, will abandon everything for the hardships of a harsh land and certain conflict? It was the oppression and persecution they endured, their rejection by their own countrymen, that forced them to leave and return to God's land of promise. When Israel was re-established in 1948, there were nations that opposed it and those that supported it. This continues to the present day and will culminate in all nations turning against Israel. And once again, in their time of distress, Israel will turn wholeheartedly to God, who will deliver them. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications. And they shall look upon me, whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. Why is there always fighting against Israel? Because Israel is the nation that God has chosen. Satan will do everything to destroy what God loves. God made a promise to Israel, and if the Israeli nation is destroyed, then the promises will not be fulfilled. We see the similarity with Joseph, whose brothers wanted to kill, so that his prophetic dreams would not come true. Likewise, if Israel is destroyed, then God's promises in the Bible will not be fulfilled, and God will be proved a liar. But we know that God is always in control. He has a plan and a purpose, and He keeps His word. Fear not, for I am with thee. I'll bring thy seed from the east, and gather thee from the west. I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, keep not back. Bring my sons from far, and my daughters from the ends of the earth, even everyone that is called by my name. For I have created him for my glory. I have formed him. Yea, I have made him. I bring near my righteousness. It shall not be far off, and my salvation shall not tarry. And I will place salvation in Zion for Israel, my glory. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away.